Part 1 begins with a galaxy exactly as it always had been, old, confident, layered with empires that had risen so high they could no longer remember falling, and at the center of that confidence sat the Concord of Systems, a council so ancient that its members measured history in stellar cycles rather than years. And when the human delegation first appeared in the outer chamber, no one bothered to lower their voices or hide their amusement, because Earth was new, painfully new, a loud feist. Growing species from a dull yellow star with no ancient ruins, no precursor relics, no mythic was carved into nebulae, just a single inhabited world and a handful of colonies clinging to nearby systems like nervous children holding a parent's coat. And Ambassador Elena Ward knew all of this as she stood at the circular platform, hands folded, posture straight, listening while the representatives of the Velkari Union, the Threx Hegemony, and the old stone-skinned Kothari spoke about humanity as, if she were not there, describing humans as adaptable but undisciplined, creative but reckless, brave but strategically shallow, and above all harmless, a species that had sprinted through technological adolescence without developing the patience or restraint that true power required. And when the laughter came, it was not cruel, just dismissive, the sound adults make when children say they want to rule the world. And the reason for this meeting, the reason Earth had been summoned, was a declaration that the Perseus arm will be formally restructured under Concord authority, a restructuring that would absorb 3 human colonies and place Earth under what the Council called protective oversight, which everyone else called ownership. And when Ward finally spoke, her voice was calm, and even as she asked whether the Council had reviewed Earth's submission files in full. And the Threx delegate clicked his mandibles and replied that humanity's disclosures had been reviewed, summarized, and archived, and that there was no need for further delay, because Earth's military capacity was insignificant on a galactic scale, its fleet outdated, its doctrines reactive, and its weapons conventional. And this was a moment when Admiral Reyes, watching from a secure chamber above Earth orbit, felt a familiar tightening in his chest that came from listening to people who had already decided the outcome, because Reyes knew what had not been submitted, not because Earth had lied, but because no one had ever asked the right questions, and the Concord had never bothered to look past surface metrics, never asked why humanity's energy output curve flattened early, why its expansion slowed deliberately, why entire research branches vanished from public databases 2 centuries earlier, written off as dead ends or ethical failures. And as Ward listened to the Council finalize their resolution, she nodded once, thanked them for their consideration, and said that Earth would require 48 standard hours to respond formally, a request that drew another wave of quiet laughter because 48 hours meant nothing when the decision was already made. And as the session adjourned, the Kothari elder rumbled to his peers that humans would adapt as they always did, because adaptation was their one real talent. And back on Earth, beneath continents, oceans, and orbital shells that the galaxy believed were civilian infrastructure, long dormant systems, registered the first legal threshold crossing in 400 years, not an attack, not a war declaration, but a loss of sovereignty recognized under ancient human law, and in facilities that no longer appeared on any map, machines that had been designed never to activate without unanimous planetary consent began to wake, their logic cores cold, patient, and utterly indifferent to galactic opinion. While Admiral Reyes stood in a room lined with names etched into alloy walls, names of projects, shut down, buried, or denied, and when the Global Council's authorization came through, he exhaled slowly and said that humanity had tried diplomacy, restraint, and transparency, and that now they would simply show the galaxy what had been hidden not out of weakness, but out of fear of what would happen if these systems were ever seen. And far beyond Earth, in the quiet lanes of the Perseus arm, sensors began detecting anomalies that did not match any known human technology. Signatures too clean, too controlled, too intentional, and for the first time in a very long while, the galaxies stopped laughing. Part 2 unfolds not with explosions or declarations, but with confusion spreading through the Perseus arm like a slow infection, because within hours of the Concord session ending, human space went quiet in a way that no species with functioning infrastructure ever allowed. Trade beacons dimmed to passive receive only, navigation relays stopped broadcasting predicted traffic flows, and the familiar human habit of constant data chatter simply vanished, which unsettled more than one logistics. Intelligence across the arm, and when Velkari patrol frigates were dispatched to one of the reassigned human colonies to perform what the Concord called a reassurance presence, they found the system unchanged yet fundamentally wrong. Stars burning as expected, orbital mechanics intact, but every human structure running on closed internal loops, shields active but non-aggressive, weapons power but unfocused, and the colony governor answering hails with a pre-recorded statement that Earth was conducting a sovereign compliance review and all external interference will be logged and remembered, a phrase that made little sense until analysts realized the wording did not threaten retaliation. It promised record-keeping, and on Concord Prime the laughter faded as report accumulated showing human fleets not mobilizing outward but folding inward. Ships disappearing from known deployments and reappearing deep inside Sol-controlled volumes that had been previously catalogued as low density. Civilian space. An ambassador ward returned to Earth to brief leaders who already knew the outcome because centuries earlier humanity had written protocol for exactly the scenario, the quiet loss of autonomy through polite legal conquest, a lesson learned not from aliens but from humanity's own bloodstained history. And deep beneath the Antarctic ice shelf, the Continuity Vault completed its consensus sweep, confirming planetary ascent not just from governments but from civilian networks, independent habitats, and long-range colony councils, and only when the final node agreed did the Vault unlock the sealed strata command authority that overrode all civilian and military chains alike, transferring control to systems that had been designed by people who believed no single generation should be trusted with absolute power, and those systems did not think in terms of victory or dominance, only in terms of preservation margins, threat modeling, and irreversible deterrence. And as Admiral Reyes was summoned to the Vault chamber, he felt the weight of history pressing down harder than any battlefield ever had. Because this was not a war room, it was a confession booth for a species admitting that it had reached the edge of tolerance, and when the primary interface came alive it did not greet him. It simply displayed a map of the galaxy stripped of politics and names, reduced to vectors, energy gradients, and causal chains. And a calm, synthetic voice informed him that the Concord restructuring increased projected human extinction probability by 12% over 5 centuries, an unacceptable delta, and that mitigation protocols were now active. Meanwhile, in the Concord itself, the Threx delegate demanded explanation for the sensor anomalies appearing across dozens of systems. Anomalies that suggested localized manipulation of vacuum energy and space-time curvature on scales that no known power, ancient or otherwise, had demonstrated. And when Kothari, scientists cross-referenced the signatures with archived human research papers long dismissed as speculative ethics-bound nonsense, the chamber fell silent. Because those papers had not failed, they had been voluntarily abandoned after succeeding too well, and the first true crack in galactic confidence came when a Velkari dreadnought performing a routine intimidation maneuver found its weapons targeting systems returning errors not from jamming but from perfect feedback loops, as if space itself refused to acknowledge hostile intent, forcing the ship to disengage lest it tear its own fire control apart. And back on Earth, Ward listened as Reyes explained that humanity had not built these systems to win wars, because wars assume survival. They had been built to make aggression irrational at a fundamental level, to reshape the cost of violence so completely that even empires would hesitate. And as the Concord called an emergency session to reassess Earth status, a message arrived from Sol that contained no threats, no demands, only a revised set of boundaries marked not by fleets but by equations, and for the first time since the Concord's founding, its members were forced to confront a terrifying realization that humanity had never been racing to catch up with the galaxy at all. It had been slowing itself down, waiting, hoping it would never need to remind the universe why some doors were sealed forever. Part 3 begins as a Concord emergency chamber fills with something it has not felt in generations, uncertainty edged with fear, because the equations transmitted from Sol are not territorial claims in any traditional sense but constraints, limits imposed on cause and effect itself, and as Concord analysts struggle to interpret them, it becomes clear that these are not warnings written for politicians or admirals but for physicists, the kind that imply irreversible consequences if violated. And the Velkari Union, proud and impatient, is the first to test them, not out of malice but out of habit, because empires accustomed to obedience rarely believe rules apply until broken, and so a Velkari task force is ordered to cross one of the newly defined boundaries under the justification of navigation recalibration, a legal fiction thin enough that even their own officers recognize it as theater. And the moment the lead cruisers Machado intersect the boundary, nothing explodes. No alarm scream, no weapons fire. Instead, the ship simply stops, not decelerates, not drifts, but becomes fixed in place as if welded to the universe, its engines burning uselessly while internal clocks desynchronize from external time, causing crew members to experience seconds out of order, memories overlapping, heartbeat skipping, and when the task force attempt to pull the cruiser free with tractor fields, those fields fold back into the emitters, overloading them with impossible readings, forcing a retreat that leave the immobilized vessel hanging like a pinned insect, alive but utterly helpless. And this event sends shockwaves to the Concorde faster than any superluminal message ever could, because for the first time the galaxy witnesses a demonstration of force that is neither destructive nor reversible, a power that does not conquer but denies. And on Earth, Admiral Reyes watches the incident unfold through abstracted telemetry feeds, his expression grim rather than triumphant, because every such activation moves humanity further away from the possibility of being misunderstood as merely another empire, and Ambassador Ward argues fiercely within the Continuity Council that a channel must remain open, that fear without context breeds escalation, but the systems now governing response calculate that clarity itself carries risk, because revealing full capabilities would collapse deterrence into inevitability, and so the message sent to the Concorde is brief and precise, stating that the immobilized vessel will remain functional and unharmed until Velkari authorities formally acknowledge the revised boundaries, after which release will occur automatically, and this conditional mercy terrifies the Concorde more than annihilation ever would have, because it demonstrates control without hatred, enforcement without anger, and restraint backed by certainty. And as days pass, reports surface from across the arm of similar phenomena, human colonies once thought lightly defended, now surrounded by invisible gradients that bend sensor returns and redirect unauthorized vessels without contact, human fleets appearing briefly in systems where no jump route should exist and vanishing just as quickly, never firing, never posturing, simply being present like punctuation marks in the grammar of space. And ancient races that have survived cycles of galactic collapse begin quietly withdrawing their support from the Concorde, recognizing a pattern they have seen only once before in deep time, when a species decides that survival is no longer a matter of negotiation, and deep within the continuity vault, the systems record a steady decline in projected extinction probability, but alongside it a rise in long-term galactic instability metrics, prompting internal debate not among humans but among the layered logic structures entrusted with humanity's future. Because a galaxy is learning too quickly, and learning provokes adaptation, and as Reyes is informed that several Concorde member states are attempting to reverse engineer the boundary effects using captured data, he knows the next phase is inevitable. Because curiosity has always been the galaxy's most dangerous trait, and humanity's greatest mistake may not be activating the systems they were never meant to see, but revealing to the universe that such systems were possible at all. Part 4 opens with the galaxy doing what it always does when fear sets in. It rationalizes, reframes, and then quietly sharpens its knives, because while public Concorde channels speak of dialogue and reassessment, private data traffic reveals a coordinated surge in black research budgets, covert physics programs, and an authorized experimentation along the very equations humanity has drawn. And this is where the misunderstanding deepens, because the Concorde believes the human systems are weapons, impressive but ultimately replicable, while the Continuity Vault understand them as constraints born from centuries of self-denial, layered safeguard designed not to dominate others but to stop humans from using them casually, and as alien laboratories push too hard, too fast, small disasters begin to ripple outward. A research station in Velkari space collapses into a zero-volume singularity after attempting localized vacuum anchoring. A Threx test array tears itself apart when causality feedback loops refuse to resolve, and each incident is officially classified while unofficially spreading panic among scientific circles that realize humanity did not merely advance beyond the galaxy, it took a different path entirely, one shaped by a species that learned early how easily cleverness could destroy everything it loved. And on 8th, Ambassador Ward stands before a divided planetary assembly as civilian feeds begin leaking fragments of the truth, because humans have always been terrible at keeping secrets from themselves, and while some celebrate the galaxy's sudden restraint, others feel what it means to live behind walls defined by equations instead of fleets, and Ward reminds them that those walls were built long ago, buried under oceans and ice not to keep aliens out, but to keep humans honest, to ensure that power born from desperation would never be wielded in arrogance. And yet desperation is exactly what begins to take hold beyond human space, as smaller species petition Earth directly for protection, bypassing the Concord entirely, not because they believe humans are benevolent conquerors, but because humans are predictable in a way empires are not. Bound by rules they argue about loudly and follow stubbornly once agreed, and the continuity systems flag this development as a destabilizing variable, because protection implies responsibility, and responsibility invites provocation, and when a fringe Concord member state launches a covert strike against one of these petitioning species in an attempt to test humanity's response threshold, the galaxy finally crosses a line it does not see, but humanity feels immediately, not through sensors or fleets, but through probability models that spike into unacceptable ranges, and Admiral Reyes is present when the systems escalate from denial to intervention, a transition marked not by alarm but by a single line of text informing him that localized corrective action is authorized, and, light years away, the attacking fleet never reaches its target. Its ships rerouted mid-jump into isolated null pockets where space behaves politely but firmly wrong, trapping them in stable orbits around nothing, alive, supplied, but unable to influence events. And the message sent afterward is again infuriatingly calm, stating that the protected species remains under human guarantee and that further violations will expand corrective zones. And this is a moment the Concord realizes too late, that humanity is not fighting a war or making an example. It is rewriting the rules of engagement so completely that violence itself becomes obsolete within human reach. And as panic spreads through councils and war rooms alike, an ancient Kothari historian whispers a truth long buried in myth, that the last time the galaxy encountered a civilization that chose containment over conquest, it was not the galaxy that decided how the story ended. Part 5 arrives with a shift so subtle that most of the galaxy misses it at first, because the humans do not escalate outward, they turn inward again, and this confounds every predictive model the Concord has left, as fleets remain inactive, boundaries unchanged, corrective zones stable, and yet influence spreads anyway, carried not by force but by precedent, as species under human guarantee begin reorganizing their defense, trade, and diplomacy around the assumption that violence is longer a viable bargaining chip, and this terrifies the old powers more than any weapon ever could, because empires are built on leverage, and leverage dies when threats stop working, and within the Concord, emergency authority fractures as member states quietly withdraw, choosing bilateral agreements with Earth over collective paralysis, while others double down, convinced that humanity's restraint is a mask that must eventually slip, and among those is the Threx Hegemony, whose internal structure cannot tolerate a universe where fear no longer enforces order, and so they pursue the only strategy left to them, exposure, leaking fragments of human system data, distorted and incomplete, to the wider galaxy in hopes of triggering a coalition response before human influence becomes normalized. But the leak backfires spectacularly, because instead of panic, it sparks a wave of uncomfortable recognition among younger species, who see in humanity's buried safeguard a reflection of their own unspoken fears about unchecked progress, and suddenly Earth is no longer an anomaly but a proof of concept, a civilization that reached the edge and stepped back on purpose. And this ideological shift alarms the continuity vault more than any hostile fleet, because ideas propagate faster than ships, and as human philosophers, engineers, and diplomats are quietly dispatched not as envoys of power but as translators of restraint, the galaxy begins to split along an unfamiliar fault line. Not conquerors versus conquered, but those willing to live within limits and those who cannot survive without dominance. And Admiral Reyes watches this unfold with a mix of grim satisfaction and dread, because he understands what the systems will not say out loud, that if a critical mass of civilizations adopts human-style containment doctrines, the old empires will have only two options left: adapt or break. And history suggests they rarely choose the former, and the breaking comes sooner than expected when a Threx internal revolt erupts, driven by factions that believe the hegemony's obsession with control has made them obsolete, and when Threx Command accuses Earth of ideological warfare, Ward responds publicly for the first time since the boundaries were drawn, stating plainly that humans are not responsible for what others see when fear stops working, and this statement spreads across the galaxy like a cultural shockwave, because it reframes power not as the ability to compel, but as the ability to refuse escalation. And deep within the continuity vault, long-dormant advisory layers activate, not to plan for war, but to model coexistence scenarios on a galactic scale, something no human system has ever attempted before. And as those projections unfold, they reveal a sobering truth, that humanity can stabilize a galaxy, or it can dominate it, but it cannot do both. And the choice between those paths is no longer theoretical, because the galaxy is beginning to choose, sides whether the Earth wants it to or not. Part 6 begins with a realization settling across human leadership that the galaxy has passed a point where neutrality is possible, because even restraint has consequences when exercised at scale, and the Continuity Vault presents its findings not as recommendations but as inevitabilities, showing branching futures where stabilization through limits leads to long-term peace punctuated by localized collapses, while domination leads to shorter calm followed by catastrophic resistance. And it is Ambassador Ward who argues that humanity's old instincts must finally be trusted, that power restrained by choice rather than fear is the only legacy worth leaving, even if it means accepting instability that cannot be solved by equations alone. And this position is tested almost immediately when a coalition of hardline Concord remnants, led quietly by Threx loyalists and desperate Velkari admirals, launches what they believe is a decisive gambit, not an attack on Earth or its guarantees, but an attempt to sabotage the underlying human system by targeting dormant infrastructure nodes revealed in the data leaks, convinced that removing the foundation will collapse the boundaries everywhere at once. And for the first time since activation, the Continuity Vault flags a scenario requiring direct human judgment rather than automated correction, because the strike is not aggressive in the traditional sense. It is surgical, calculated to avoid immediate harm while restoring leverage. And Admiral Reyes is brought into the Vault chamber alongside civilian leaders, scientists, and ethicists, all facing the uncomfortable truth that the systems they built to remove emotion from existential decisions have now reached a question only emotion can answer: whether humanity is willing to be seen enforcing peace actively rather than passively. And as the coalition strike force crosses into human space through a corridor thought unreachable, the Vault authorizes containment rather than denial, allowing the fleet to proceed under observation, and what happens next rewrites every remaining assumption the galaxy holds, because instead of being trapped or immobilized, the coalition ships are met by human vessels that do not match any known design, not warships in the classic sense, but platforms built for dialogue under threat, their presence altering local physics just enough to equalize capabilities, stripping away technological asymmetry so that no side holds an overwhelming advantage, and communication opens without demands or ultimatums, with Ward herself addressing the coalition commanders, telling them that humanity will not stop them by force because doing so would only prove their fears justified, but that if they proceed, the systems will record their choice and adapt accordingly, not to punish, but to exclude them permanently from any space where limits are respected, effectively exiling them from the future they are trying to preserve. And this ultimatum, quiet and absolute, fractures the coalition in real time, as some commanders power down and withdraw, unwilling to trade relevance for pride, while others press on, only to find their ships gradually losing access to shared space-time frameworks, their drives functioning but no longer compatible with the stabilized region spreading across the arm, leaving them isolated, able to move, but nowhere meaningful to go. And this outcome sends a message far louder than destruction ever could, that humanity's power is not the ability to stop you, but the ability to move on without you. And as news of the fracture spreads, the remaining Concord structure collapses not in fire but in irrelevance, replaced by overlapping networks of mutual limitation agreements modeled loosely on human precedent. And deep in the Vault, extinction probabilities drop to their lowest recorded levels, even as uncertainty remains high, prompting one final internal flag, that the story is not over, only transformed, because a galaxy taught to live without fear will still struggle, still fail, still fight, but it will no longer do so under the illusion that force alone decides what endures. Part 7 closes not with triumph, but with a quieter reckoning that settles over the galaxy like a long overdue dawn, because after the coalition fracture there is no final battle, no decisive explosion, only the slow undeniable realization that the old order has ended without anyone formally declaring it dead, and in its place spreads a web of stabilized regions where physics behaves consistently, trade flows without coercion, and disputes are resolved under shared limitation frameworks that make conquest impractical rather than forbidden. And humanity does not rule these regions, does not command fleets or collect tribute. It simply maintains the underlying constraints and then steps back, forcing every participant to confront who they are when fear is no longer a currency. And this proved harder than war for many species, because war allows excuses, while restraint demands accountability. And on Earth, the Continuity Vault begins its gradual de-escalation cycle, not shutting down, but redistributing authority back to human institutions, satisfied that the extinction threshold that was built to prevent her receded far enough to trust fallible hands again, and Admiral Reyes retires quietly, declining every offer of honor, knowing that the greatest success of his career is that nothing spectacular remains for him to command, while Ambassador Ward addresses the galaxy one final time, not from a throne or council chamber, but from an ordinary assembly hall, stating plainly that humanity never wanted to be feared or worshipped, only left unprovoked, and that the systems now shaping the galaxy were not a declaration of superiority but an admission of weakness, proof that humans understood better than most how easily power corrodes judgment, and as generations pass this truth becomes history rather than headline. Taught in alien academies as the moment the galaxy learned that the most dangerous species was not the one with the biggest weapons, but the one willing to build them and then lock them away. And somewhere far beyond Sol, the immobilized Velkari cruiser is finally released, its crew returning home to a civilization forever changed by the memory of being stopped without being harmed, and the galaxy never laugh at Earth again, not because it fears humanity's hidden systems, but because it understands at last that those systems were never meant to be seen, only to ensure that no one would ever again mistake patience for weakness or silence for surrender.